All right. Well, welcome everyone. I am here today with Kenneth Valpey, I'm sorry, Dr. Kenneth Valpey. Kenneth is a research fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. He's also a very active and published author. His most recent book, Cow Care in Hindu Animal Ethics, and it's my understanding that Kenneth is also currently working on a book on animal ethics. Today, I'm going to speak with Kenneth about Hinduism in general. We're going to talk about some of the big questions of life, and get Kenneth's perspective and maybe dig into a little bit of what Hinduism is. So thank you for joining me, Kenneth. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's easy to do these days online.
Yeah. So to start off with, we'll just jump straight into it. In your own understanding, what is Hinduism?
Well, I'd like to first consider that term a little bit because anything with an ism on the end makes me a little nervous. It might be easier to talk about Hindu traditions in the plural. The term Hinduism doesn't really come into use until the 19th century, sort of an import by the British, who, of course, had their empire. Well, outside of London, Calcutta was the second center of their empire for quite some time. So they kind of invented the term Hinduism. But Hindu traditions, I think we can safely talk about, even though the word Hindu, we also don't find in the literature which Hindus follow, the scriptures which Hindus follow. The term is basically coming from outside India, referring to those people who live in India. They were called Hindus. What is Hinduism? What are Hindu traditions? Sometimes it's said, whatever you say about Hindu traditions, the opposite is also true. But I think a possibly easy place to start would be with a major scripture, one which is widely known, and that is the Bhagavad Gita. And it may be of interest, I learned this several years ago, that there are three scriptures of the world which have been translated more times from their original languages into English than any others. First, there's the Bible. There's the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese Taoist work. And third, there's the Bhagavad Gita. And I know there are at least 250, probably by now 300 different English translations of the Bhagavad Gita. That's, of course, not including so many other languages. So the Bhagavad Gita it's a philosophical text, and it's also a theological text. It's an interesting text because it's a conversation. It's a dialogue. It's a dialogue which is taking place in where you wouldn't expect a dialogue like this to happen, namely on a battlefield, just prior to the beginning of the great battle of Kurukshetra, which is described in the epic called the Mahabharata. excuse me for bringing up technical terms and names,
Oh, you're
but
good. Yeah.
sometimes hard to avoid. Mahabharata is a huge, huge book. It's said to be 8 times the size of the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. And within that is this small, small section of 700 strophes or verses in Sanskrit language, the Bhagavad Gita. And it's very much dealing with fundamental questions. Who are we? What is the purpose of life? It's dealing with who is God. It's dealing with what is this world. So cosmology, excuse me. What is time? And especially it's dealing with the term karma. Karma is something, it's become something of a household word in the West now in recent decades. We hear it being bounced around. The word karma literally means action or work. And it can also mean to make. And what's interesting about it is that it's addressing what we may call the problem of human existence. The problem of human existence being that we are faced with the reality that we must die, and we don't want that to happen. And in the face of death, we are living our lives, largely ignoring this reality and this fact, but it's always there to haunt us in various ways. Now, what does that have to do with karma? Well, karma means action. And we understand there is a kind of invisible, what's sometimes called a law, a sort of cosmic law, which is wherever there's action, there will be reaction. So it's kind of, what is it, Newton's second law of motion or something. But this is working on a moral dimension. And the problem is that we may say, okay, so I'm going to work, I'm going to act, I'm going to work in such a way, I'm just going to always be good. Well, that's nice. We should certainly do our best to be good. And we may have guidelines for that, such as the Bhagavad Gita and much other literature, and so many scriptures of the world are giving us guidelines for good action. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and so on. But the problem is that even good action is what is called binding. It binds us. What does that mean? Well, what we understand, what Krishna is explaining to his friend Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, in this conversation, this dialogue, is that being bound to this world means that after this life, we will be forced into another body, and that body may not be one that we're so happy with. So action, good action, bad action, we can do our best, but it's sort of like quicksand, you know. You try to pull one foot out, and then it just pulls the other foot deeper in. So, and Krishna explains in quite some detail in the Bhagavad Gita that you may say, okay, so then I won't do anything. I'm going to stop acting altogether. I'm just gonna sit in one place and meditate. Krishna says that's not going to work either, because that your so-called non-action is just another form of action. So he says everyone has to act. We cannot avoid it. So then what to do? Because one of the very broad aims of Hinduism, we can say, is to attain what in Sanskrit is called moksha, or liberation. And, what that generally means is liberation from this repetition of death and rebirth, and again death, and again rebirth. And someone may say, well, that sounds really dark. I mean, life's not all that bad. I'm actually enjoying life most of the time. Yes, it may seem like that. And certainly joy is there, happiness is there. And why is that happiness there? Why is that joy there? Because that is our essential nature. And when I say our, when I say we, I'm referring to not just human beings, but all living beings. Again, from Bhagavad Gita, we understand that we, all living beings, have essentially three characteristics. One is that we are without beginning and without end. So we're eternal. Second, we are full of knowledge, which is very different from what we experience. We come into this world completely ignorant. And the third thing is we're full of joy or bliss. And these three characteristics we see practically. We're always looking for these. We're always striving for these. And so then the question becomes how to find this reality of ourselves. And for that, Hindu traditions offer different, what we may call currents of practice. The technical term is marga. Marga means path. So there are pathways to practice. And the one which is most widely heard of nowadays is yoga. Now, of course, yoga generally people think of as kind of physical exercise, yoga studios and so on. That's actually just one fraction of the full practice of yoga, which is about learning to control the mind and focus the mind. Because one thing that Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita is that whatever and wherever our mind is focused at the time of our death, that will determine our next life. And so the idea is that this human life in particular is an opportunity to prepare, to practice, to prepare ourselves, not just for the end of this life, but to end all of these temporary lives and to enter into eternal life, full of knowledge, full of bliss. I'm sort of rambling on, so maybe I should stop and see what you want to know more about or less about.
That was fantastic. Yeah. Um, I was trying to take notes because you brought up a lot of points that I really want to ask you about.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm trying to decide where to start. I definitely want to come back to the Gita, so don't let me forget that.
Okay.
Oftentimes, when I'm tasked with teaching a very broad class like World History 1,
Yeah.
I have to teach the Gita, and I get like 45 minutes to do it. So
Right.
um,
Yeah.
I
I've
have,
had that experience myself.
yeah. So you know how frustrating slash impossible that is. But
Yeah.
um, I want to come back to a question that you mentioned, and this will probably tie into some of the aspects that you already talked about. Um, I'll ask it very broadly, and feel free to take this however you want to. But
Hmm.
who are we?
Ah, yes. Well, as I was saying, we are um, eternal beings. We are sentient, and we are persons. And that is something that's irreducible. We are, um, and person means we are always in relation to other persons. And it means that we are in relation to a supreme person. So again, a couple of technical terms, but from Bhagavad Gita, we get the term Atma, which can mean just self, referring to that which exists beyond the body. And then Param Atma, or the higher self,
Hmm.
which is said to accompany the individual self. And the Bhagavad Gita sometimes uses analogies, simple analogies, to help us grasp what's otherwise quite abstract. So for this, one analogy it uses is the changing bodies analogy, that
Mhm.
we can sit down and look at photos of ourselves when we were kids, and we turn the page. Well, nowadays we click the computer, but
Yeah.
later and later and later pictures of ourselves with our family and our friends. And we may be looking with a friend and we say, yeah, that's me when I was 5 years old.
Mm.
And the friend, if the friend wanted to be devil's advocate, could say, no, that's not you. That somebody else. Biology tells us that the cells of the body have changed every 7 years completely, and so on. And you can say, that may well be, but that's me. It's not somebody else. Or the legal system. Say I commit some crime, I steal something, God forbid, from a shop, and I'm caught and I'm brought in the court, and they witness against me, and I say, no, that wasn't me. That was somebody, last week,
Mm.
but I'm different now. Which is one of the arguments that you can say the Hindu tradition in general has against Buddhist traditions in general,
Mm.
where the challenge is, the Buddhist challenge is that actually there is no self. Your problem is that you are thinking that you are self.
Mhm.
And there have been volumes and volumes written on this over centuries. But just sort of in simple terms of our own experience, we can understand there's something continuous, which indicates that there is an existing self. And what Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita is that just as we have this experience of the change in the course of the days, weeks, months, and years of this life. Similarly, there's going to be a change at the time of death. And then he says that a person who is enlightened, who is prepared, will not be disturbed at the time of death, because he or she knows, I'm just moving on, just like someone, we would walk from one room into another. Now, another point, who are we? And this is something which I personally found very, very liberating, especially as a young person when I first heard this, especially in American culture, I think. I grew up in California, and the whole media culture, everything is sort of driving us with this idea that you must enjoy. You are an enjoyer. You must enjoy. You must, make your life worthwhile by enjoying. Well, Krishna says, don't waste your time. You're not an enjoyer. I am the enjoyer. God is the enjoyer. And our business is to provide pleasure to God. And so our position is that we are servants. And that never changes. And this points to, this explains a lot of, you could say, world history. You were talking about teaching world history. World history is about, if you want to sum it up in one sentence, it's about human beings all trying to be master.
Yeah.
Everyone's trying to be a master of someone or something or some territory, when it's never going to work. So the idea of, in the Hindu traditions generally, is to recognize this point, that we're actually in a position to serve. And when we find the right person to serve, namely the Supreme Person, then we can actually be happy in that reciprocation of personhood, ourselves as persons with the Supreme Person, who is the perfect reciprocator, if you like.
So kind of building off of this, and I was looking for my copy of the Bhagavad Gita. So oftentimes when I teach this, it's usually, and I would be more than happy to get your recommendation on a translation. This is probably the best one that I've found thus far. And it's
yes.
fairly cheap, so accessible to students.
Yes.
There's I think it's in the first, it's got to be in the first couple of chapters. You spoke about, there's this really famous scene where, is it Arjun or Arjuna? I've heard it pronounced.
Well, it depends if you want to be more like Sanskrit pronunciation, which would be Arjuna, or you want to be more like modern Hindi, which would be Arjun.
Arjun. Okay.
Yeah.
I've been saying Arjun for a long time, so
that's fine.
I'll stick with that.
Yeah.
So there's this famous scene that you mentioned, where Arjun is presented with the opposing forces, and he's kind of, I guess my interpretation has always been kind of overwhelmed with the enormity of the task, the kind of impossibility of the task. There's also the scene where he looks out and he says he sees his family, he sees kind of the lineage. I think it's grandfathers, fathers, grandsons,
Mhm.
great grandsons, and he just sits down, right? He's unable to. And then in the next chapter, we get Krishna's urging to call to action,
Right.
basically. And so this brings up this concept of dharma. I was
Mhm.
wondering if you can speak a little bit to that, because this is usually a big
Yeah.
question that I have from students.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with this word, dharma, which is a Sanskrit word. And it's one of those words that everyone wrestles with because it gets translated in dozens of different ways. A simple way it's translated often is duty.
Mm.
But I think what is a source of one problem of translation is that dharma deals, in a sense, on two levels. One is descriptive and one is prescriptive. And what I was saying a minute ago about we as living beings being servant, that would be a description of our fundamental nature. So that's descriptive side of dharma. And based on that understanding, then comes the question, what should I do? And the word should, of course, indicates obligation. And in some of the more ancient texts, and this goes back before the Bhagavad Gita to the Upanishads, these are also dialogues. There's a notion of debt that we are born with. We are born into debt. And some texts refer to 3 kinds of debt, and some texts refer to 5 kinds of debt. But before going into what those are, just to say that it's understood, these have to be paid off, and that is dharma. But to get back to this word dharma and its sort of etymology, we can say, it has to do with holding and upholding and sustaining. So to practice dharma is to participate, we can say, in sustaining sustaining the world, sustaining the cosmos, sustaining our own lives, individual and collective, our family, and so on. And then it comes down to more details. Okay, what is your dharma? What should you be doing? And you mentioned with Arjuna, I'm accustomed to say Arjuna.
Okay, yeah.
And Krishna is telling him, after Arjuna says, I'm not going to fight, which is a huge shock in the context of the whole Mahabharata, because Arjuna is the paradigmatic warrior hero who is always successful in battle. And he's saying, I'm not going to fight? What? And so Krishna says, no, come on, you have to fight. You're a kshatriya. Kshatriya is the Sanskrit word for warrior. And that's your duty. Your duty is to fight. And if you do your duty, then we can, if we get into Western ethics, we can say this is the deontological sort of ethics. This is your duty. Don't think about the consequences. You just do your duty, and this will be the best thing that you can do. So I used the word kshatriya, and that points to another term which typically makes us nervous in the West. We hear the word caste, which I think came from a Portuguese word. When the Portuguese went to India, they kind of looked around and said, oh, what is this? There are different categories of people, and they called them caste. The Sanskrit word is, there are two words. One is Varna, which literally means color, but it comes to mean essentially occupational propensity. And that's another subject that volumes and volumes have been written about, but in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna refers to it. He says, this is a system which is based on what's called guna, or qualities, and karma, our action, what we actually do. And so often dharma is portrayed in terms of this subject of who are you in terms of your Varna. But in modern India, we don't actually hear so much about Varna, and this is where the plot thickens. There's another term which is mentioned once in the beginning of Bhagavad Gita, and then it's not elaborated, but it's jaati. And jaati is, well, you could say it's the more specific side of Varna. So someone may be a kshatriya, broadly speaking, and more specifically, maybe their family tradition is specialized in, let's say, a particular type of fighting. Maybe they are horse soldiers, something like that. Anthropologists estimate that there are now some 3,000 jatis in India at present, and probably most of them don't actually follow their particular occupations of their original jatis. Everyone is doing something else. So, but still, these are, these can be very significant for people. And therefore, people will, they will ask, what is your family name? And you say your name, and from that, they'll immediately know what is your jati. And what does this come to, how does it play out in daily life, especially in India, especially in village India, less and less in metropole? It plays out in two areas. One is the question of who do you marry? And the other question is, who will you dine with? And unfortunately, whatever good intentions they may have had, the British colonialists in the 19th century, when they encountered the so-called caste system, they took it very seriously, and they wanted to catalog all the castes. And they did this in a very artificial way, trying to make a sort of single scale, top to bottom. And what happened was the Indians took the British seriously and tried to position themselves always higher on the British scale. And it's been trouble ever since. So in the Bhagavad Gita, going back to Krishna and Arjuna, they're not concerned with that. In fact, quite the opposite. The whole point of this is simply to facilitate the sort of smooth running of society so that we can concentrate on what really matters, which is self-realization and God realization. And there's a verse in the 5th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that says, Vidya vinaya sampanne brahmane gavihastini shuni chaiva shvapakecha pandita samadarshina. Samadarshina, pandit. Pandit means a learned person, and samadarshan means one who sees equally. He sees all beings, and it mentions a cow, an elephant, a dog, a Brahmin, which is the priestly caste, so to speak, or someone who is, a street sweeper, if you like. The Pandit sees everyone equally. And that's the aim. I mentioned yoga. That's one of the deeper purposes of yoga, is to develop that vision and to act on that vision. Well, I'm rambling again.
No, that was great. So you outlined, I think, very nicely who we are, this idea of dharma. I was wondering if you could speak for a little bit on the nature of the divine, maybe phrase it this way, and feel free to change the phrasing of the question. Who or what is God?
Okay. Yeah, good question. Again, it's subject of Bhagavad Gita, and Krishna uses various terms. One of them is Ishvara, which means controller. And another term used is Bhagavan, which kind of literally means one who possesses opulences. So Bhagavan, one definition by one of the early theologians of the tradition is that Bhagavan is he who possesses unlimited qualities and opulences to an unlimited degree.
Okay.
And again, as I mentioned before, the understanding is God is a person, which means, we can take the standard understandings that we get from Western theology, omniscience, omnipotence, what is it?
Omnipresence. Yeah.
Omnipresence, yes, and so on. Those are certainly all included. And there's something more. And that something more comes back to the point of relationality, which I said is integral to being a person, that every being has a relation with God, which we want to develop. And that relation is analogous to relations we have in this world. We have friends, so a possible relationship with God is one of friendship, in which the sense is not that, oh, this is God, I must bow down, but it's more like a sense of equality. And one example of this is Krishna and Arjuna. They are friends. Another relationship that's possible, which is explored extensively in a much larger work called the Bhagavata Purāṇa, which I've worked on, you may have seen on my website. We've published, myself and my colleague have published a couple of books. One is a reader on the Bhagavata. So one possible relationship is parent and child, where one feels oneself to be the parent and God to be the child, rather than the other way around.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And what this is highlighting is the sense that God allows himself to become dependent on his devotee. And another relationship which is possible and which is also described extensively in the Bhagavata Purāṇa is the conjugal relationship, the relationship between a lover and beloved. And this is not unique to this tradition. We find it expressed in the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Songs. And I believe there are also expressions of it in other traditions, mystical traditions usually. But here the point is that it's the emphasis is on relationship. Now, some people will say, "Oh, no, wait. You're misrepresenting Hinduism. Hinduism is actually about realizing the supreme, absolute, impersonal or non-personal Brahman, as it's called, the absolute." And this is a kind of perpetual point of contention in Indian philosophical and theological traditions. We have what's known most widely in the West. There is the philosophical tradition of Vedanta, and then what's known in the West is usually a kind of neo-Vedanta, which takes this non-dualist understanding that the ultimate, they will say, and this is something that my tradition would vehemently disagree with, but they will say that, no, you must go beyond that idea of relationality to the ultimate oneness in which personality is no longer there. But the vast majority of practicing Hindus in India are not really subscribing to that. They're subscribing to a personalist understanding. So yeah, God is a person. And one of the interesting features of this, I spoke of Bhagavan, I spoke of opulence, and one of the we say opulences of God is that, well, he is full of wealth, strength, fame, beauty, knowledge, and renunciation. Renunciation meaning he is perfectly detached from all that he is, all that he possesses. Who or what is God? We can also talk about in terms of excuse me, in terms of names. We understand that God has unlimited names, which describe his qualities. And I keep saying his, but there is also very strong representation in India tradition that God is ultimately feminine. So they will focus on the feminine understanding of the Supreme. Names are understood to be of special power, and in particular for us in this world, in this age. What I mean by this age is, again, from the work in which we find the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, there's a notion of yugas. These are long ages. And we find ourselves, according to that calculation, in the beginning of a very long age of degradation. It's getting worse, it's not getting better, and our capacities are getting weaker, and our lives are not getting longer, they're getting shorter, and so on. So our capacity for self-realization and God realization becomes very limited. And so what to do, the recommendation is to call out, to repeat, to chant mantra, which consists of names of God. Because these names are forms of God by which we can make a direct connection. The word yoga literally means connection. And through sound vibration, we can connect with God. So there are many names. The ones in my tradition most favored are Krishna and Rama, also Hari and Govinda, but any number of names which describe his qualities and also what are called his pastimes. Another sort of telltale feature, broadly speaking, of Hindu traditions, particularly those following the Vaishnava stream. Vaishnava meaning those who identify God as with the name Vishnu. Vishnu is a very prominent understanding of the person of God, is that because God is all-powerful, and because God is concerned for his creation, he takes the trouble to appear in this world in different times and different places and in different forms. The general term here, again, a Sanskrit term, is avatar. And I know that term has been taken over by the computer games industry, but it originally means one who crosses down, one who descends. And the understanding is that God will appear in order to give information about how to approach him. And so he comes at different times and reveals in different ways how to approach him and to reestablish processes for humans to progress in their purpose in life, what we call dharma in the sense of what we should do, prescriptive dharma.
So you take a more, and I'm going to have to apply some Western concepts here, so forgive me. Because I will say that it's very difficult to get my hands on like solid, and I would be more than happy to hear your recommendations later, solid information about Hinduism that's been translated into English. So oftentimes I think what we get might be a little skewed. One of the big questions that I get asked from students that I'll ask you and then figure out if I've been answering it wrong this whole time. So you have this on a surface level, people that aren't familiar to Hinduism come to Hinduism and they see all of these different gods and goddesses. And one of the approaches that you mentioned is the idea that, yes, you have all of these different gods and goddesses, but all of these different gods and goddesses are manifestations or representations of a single divine entity slash being slash substance, however you want to phrase that. But what you were saying just now was that the divine, you talked a lot about relationality, about entering into a relationship with the divine in the same way that a parent to child relationship or lover to beloved relationship. So can you speak a little bit more about that sort of difference there, maybe where you fall on that sort of spectrum?
Yeah, often the accusation is that, oh, this is polytheism, right? And it's interesting because going back to the very early sacred texts, the Veda, the Rig Veda, which is, scholars will say it's from latest 1000 before the Common Era, more likely 1200 or 1500. It's, anybody's guess. The tradition says these texts are eternal. They simply manifest in time. There are hymns to any number of different gods. And then you come to the Upanishads, in which there's a very interesting conversation in which one student is asking a teacher, how many gods are there? And he says, there are, what's the number he gives? I think he says, there are 3,306, something like that.
Yeah.
And then he says, actually, no. And he gives half the number, or 1/10, I don't remember. And he says, actually, no. And he keeps cutting it down. And then finally says, actually, there's only one God in the end. Okay, but then if there's only one God, what is this with all the different hymns to different gods? Yes, they would be understood to be different manifestations of the one God performing different functions and reciprocating with different worshipers according to their desires. So, and the word desire, this gets right down to the core of things. We find ourselves in this world as bundles of desire. And what do we do with this? So one aspect of the, broadly speaking, Hindu tradition is saying, we'll accommodate them, but we'll accommodate them in ways which, sort of despite yourself, are going to elevate you. All you have to do is follow the rules of how to, worship this particular divinity, do this particular austerity, this particular fasting, go on this particular pilgrimage, and so on. And you're going to hope that by doing all this, you're going to, you're going to pass your final exam. Okay. So, we're going to help you with that, but we're going to get you further than that. We're going to get you eventually to a point where you're going to be asking yourself, why am I doing all this? And why am I pursuing this, what I think is going to bring me happiness, when what I realize is it's not bringing me happiness. And that could take lifetimes to realize. It could take lifetimes, or, and this is where, again, broadly speaking, Hindu traditions would say, save yourself time and find yourself a proper qualified teacher of spiritual knowledge. The Sanskrit word guru is there, which has also been taken on in the West. You have computer gurus and whatever.
Yeah.
But originally, guru had the sense of someone who is charged with knowledge, with spiritual knowledge. How am I going to get a final solution to my problem? So God, one or many? Well, ultimately one. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna even says, out of ignorance, people worship different gods, and I give them the faith to do that. He doesn't say, I am a jealous God. He says, you want to worship this God, go right ahead. Not only that, I'll give you the faith to do it.
So it's a more, and in religious studies, you kind of have this distinction between exclusive and inclusive religious traditions.
Right.
So in that respect, would it be fair to classify it as more inclusive, right? Respectful of different beliefs / traditions?
Yes. Broadly speaking, I would say the emphasis is on inclusivism, although one does find fairly exclusivist kind of statements as well. But then you have to see sort of who is being addressed, for which audience is a particular statement being given. But yes, in the main, I would say there's an inclusiveness. In one phrase in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Mama Vartmanu Vartante Manusya Partha Sarvasha. He says, everyone follows my path in all respects. It's already going on. Everyone's, he doesn't use the word Hindu. He doesn't say everyone is Hindu. He's saying that, there's already a process going on. Everyone is on that path. Some are moving kind of slowly. Some may be kind of spinning in their tracks, but it's everybody's there.
To kind of wrap things up here,
Mm-hmm.
if you have somebody that's that listens to this, or if somebody stumbles across this on YouTube, or if God forbid somebody takes one of my classes and they're interested in furthering their knowledge of what was talked about here,
Mm-hmm.
what would you recommend to somebody started on that beginner level?
Yeah, there are a lot of books that are kind of introduction to Hinduism, but we kind of started out with Bhagavad Gita, and you mentioned, or you showed one translation. Here I'm going to sound, for some, I'm going to sound a little sectarian, but I would recommend my own guru's Bhagavad Gita, which has a title, Bhagavad Gita as It Is, which is, there's a message in the title. The point that he's making with that is that what's being missed in so many translations is the sort of core spirit of the Gita, which is accepting Krishna's position as he speaks to Arjuna, his position as Bhagavan, as Parameshvara, as Yogeshvara, as the supreme yogi. And so in his edition, which includes his commentary, he's very much emphasizing this point. And he's emphasizing that to really, if we want to benefit from it, from understanding what it's about, then it's really good to hear from someone, or to read from someone who is connected to the tradition itself, not from outsiders who are sort of not really able to enter into. Because Krishna says in the beginning of the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, he says, Raja Vidya, Raja Guhyam, Pavitram Idam Uttamam. Guhya means confidential or secret. It says this is the king of knowledge, the king of secrets. So to really enter into it, for that purpose, I would recommend like that. And then an initial entry into this other book I mentioned, the Bhagavata Purāṇa. Here I'm going to be a little bit self-promoting, but we published a selected readings from the Bhagavata Purāṇa with Columbia University Press, myself and Ravi Gupta, which I think is, I think it's manageable. And it's goes along with a second volume, which we published first, which is a collection of articles by 12 scholars taking the Bhagavatam thematically. But if one wants to know more about kind of Hinduism on the ground, the lived life of Hindus, there are a number of books, and the particular title and authors just slipped my mind of the one that's kind of famous for this, but overviews of Hinduism are many. Klaus Klostermaier has done one. Gavin Flood has also. Another thing that may be of interest, although, I'll just mention I'm connected with the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, which offers many, many courses in all different aspects of Hinduism. There's a charge for each course, but they're all taught by very qualified people. And one can pick and choose what one likes to study. That's the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, which you can find online.
All right. I will do my best to link those sources that you just mentioned in the description of the video if anyone is interested.
Sure. Okay, good.
I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet with me. I found this super helpful and beneficial. I learned a lot, so thank you very much.
I hope I didn't confuse you more than what you started with.
No, it's I mean, these things, you oftentimes just get a super brief introduction in like a standard college course or even a high school course. These things take a long time to sit with, to digest, to process. This was very enlightening for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.